It was a quiet morning when James boarded his bus, ready to start his shift. He had been a bus driver for many years, and every day felt like another familiar routine. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows over the empty seats. As he pulled out from the station, James glanced at the streets outside and waved at the regulars who were heading to work. He was used to these moments of peace, where everything seemed to flow smoothly and the world moved at its usual pace. But today something felt different. As James made his way down the busy streets, he spotted a young man waiting at the bus stop. The man looked out of place. He was standing near the curb, his eyes darting around nervously, almost as if he wasn't sure where he was supposed to be. His clothes were ragged, his face drawn with worry. As James pulled up to the stop, the young man hesitated for a moment, then stepped onto the bus. His eyes met James's for a brief moment, and James noticed the heaviness in them. This wasn't just a regular commuter. Something was wrong. James greeted him with a friendly smile, as he always did with new passengers, but the young man didn't respond. Instead, he walked to a seat near the back of the bus and sat down. James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. James had always been the type of person who paid attention to the little things, the way people acted, the way they looked when they got on the bus. He wasn't just driving, he was connecting with people, even if it was just for a few minutes each day. The young man seemed to be carrying a weight, something more than just the daily grind of life. His movements were stiff, almost robotic, as if he didn't know how to let go of the tension that seemed to have gripped him. The bus began to fill up with other passengers, each one lost in their own world. Some were reading, others were staring out the window. But James kept his eyes on the young man. There was something about him that pulled at his heart. James couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew the kid needed help. As the bus turned onto a different route, the young man seemed to relax slightly. He shifted in his seat, but his hands were still clenched tightly on his lap, his body rigid. James decided to take a chance and spoke up. "You okay, man?" he asked, trying to sound as casual as possible, as if he were just making small talk. The young man looked up at James, startled by the question. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his gaze shifting back to the floor. Then, he sighed deeply, and James could see the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. "I'm fine," the young man muttered, but the words were hollow. James could tell he wasn't being truthful. The weariness in the young man's voice, the sadness that seemed to seep into every word, told James there was much more beneath the surface. James took a deep breath. He had seen his fair share of people struggling, whether it was with work, relationships, or just the weight of life. But something about this young man was different. James had lived a good life, but he knew what it felt like to struggle. Maybe that's why he couldn't just let this kid go without offering something more. "I know things can get tough sometimes," James said, trying to make his voice sound as comforting as possible. "But you don't have to face it alone. There are places you can go, people who can help." The young man looked up at James again, this time with a flicker of surprise. It was clear he hadn't expected someone to talk to him like this. His face softened, and for a moment James saw a different side of him, vulnerable, scared, and uncertain. "I don't know if it'll help," the young man replied quietly. "Everything feels like it's falling apart. I don't know where to go anymore." James nodded, understanding more than the young man realized. "I get it," he said. "But it's never too late to ask for help. There's a shelter down the road. They'll take you in. They've got support and services to help you get back on your feet." The young man hesitated, and for a moment James wasn't sure if he would take the advice. But then the young man gave a small nod, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He still didn't look entirely convinced, but there was a hint of hope in his eyes. "Maybe I'll check it out," the young man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks for talking to me." James smiled, giving him a reassuring nod. "Anytime, man," he said. "Take care of yourself." As the bus continued its route, James couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. The young man wasn't out of the woods yet, but maybe, just maybe, his words had planted a seed of hope in him. James couldn't help but wonder what would happen to him next. By the time the bus arrived at the end of the route, the young man had gotten off at the stop near the shelter. He didn't look back, but James could see that he had made a choice. A small step, but it was a step forward. James watched the young man walk away, disappearing into the distance. He knew it wasn't going to be easy for him, But he also knew that sometimes all it took was someone showing that they cared. It wasn't much, but for the young man it might just be enough. As James made his way back to the bus depot, he reflected on the encounter. It wasn't a big moment in the grand scheme of things, but it felt significant. He had made a difference, even if it was just in one person's life. That was enough for him. He didn't need thanks or recognition. He only needed to know that his words, his actions, had meant something. And maybe, just maybe, the young man would find his way. Maybe he would take the advice, find the help he needed, and turn his life around. Or maybe he wouldn't, but James knew he had done what he could. And that was all he could ask for. The next day, James resumed his usual route, the steady hum of the bus as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The morning sun had risen bright and clear, casting a warm glow over the city streets. He greeted the regulars who got on, exchanged pleasantries, and settled into the rhythm of his day. But despite the bustling activity around him, he couldn't stop thinking about the young man from the day before. Derek. He remembered the name now, though he hadn't asked for it. He wondered if the young man had followed through with the suggestion, if he had sought help at the shelter or taken that first small step toward change. It was hard to shake the image of Derek's face, the sadness in his eyes that spoke of years of pain and uncertainty. James hoped with all his heart that the brief conversation they'd shared had made a difference. But as the day wore on, James began to wonder if perhaps he had been too optimistic. People came and went on his bus every day, each one with their own struggles, their own story. How many of them had he tried to help, only for them to disappear into the crowd, never to be seen again? It was easy to tell himself that his words mattered, but James knew better than anyone that not every story had a happy ending. When he reached the end of his route, he had already decided that he would keep an eye out for Derek. If the young man came back to the bus, James would be there, ready to lend an ear once again. But by the end of the day, there was still no sign of him. The following morning, as James boarded the bus, he felt a strange sense of unease. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets. He hoped today would be different. But as he started his route, the sense of anticipation that had been building inside him all morning quickly faded. The bus was as empty as usual, and the regular commuters boarded with their heads down, lost in their own worlds. James's thoughts drifted back to Derek. He wondered if the young man had taken the advice to heart, or if his problems had swallowed him whole once again. Maybe he had gone to the shelter, only to find the walls closing in around him, or maybe he had given up on even trying. It was hard to say. Halfway through his route, James felt a tap on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see one of the regular passengers, a middle-aged man named Mr. Williams, standing in the aisle. "Hey, you good?" Mr. Williams asked, his face filled with concern. James blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "You seem a bit off today," Mr. Williams replied, his tone gentle but observant. "Everything okay?" James hesitated, but something about Mr. Williams' kindness made him feel like he could open up. "I'm just thinking about someone I met yesterday," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Mr. Williams raised an eyebrow. "Anyone I know?" James shook his head. "A young guy. He seemed like he was struggling, like he needed someone to talk to. I gave him some advice, told him about a shelter nearby. But now, I don't know if he took it seriously." "It's hard not knowing if what you say really makes a difference." Mr. Williams nodded slowly. "You've got a good heart, James. People like you are hard to come by. Sometimes all it takes is planting a seed. Even if he doesn't follow your advice right away, maybe it'll stick with him. Maybe one day he'll remember your words and make the change he needs." James sighed. "I hope so." "I just don't want him to get lost." Mr. Williams clapped him on the shoulder. "You did what you could. That's all anyone can ask for. Sometimes the rest is out of our hands." The conversation helped calm James's nerves, but still, he couldn't shake the feeling of worry that clung to him. He continued his route, driving through the city streets, but his mind kept drifting back to Derek. As the day progressed, there were still no signs of the young man. By mid-afternoon, James started to wonder if he'd ever see Derek again. It wasn't that he was disappointed, but he couldn't help but feel that there was more to the young man's story. James knew what it was like to be lost, to feel like there was no way out. He had been there himself many years ago before he found his way. He wished he could do more to help, but all he could offer were words, and even those felt so small compared to the weight of the world Derek seemed to be carrying. Just as James was beginning to lose hope, he spotted a familiar figure waiting at the bus stop as he approached. It was Derek. The young man was standing by the curb, his posture slouched, his eyes fixed on the ground. But this time there was something different about him. He wasn't the same lost soul James had seen the day before. There was a quiet determination in his steps as he made his way toward the bus. James couldn't help but feel a surge of relief when Derek stepped on board. This time he didn't just sit in the back. He moved up to the middle of the bus and sat down in a seat near the front. His eyes briefly met James, and for the first time James saw a glimmer of hope in them. "Hey man," James said, trying to sound casual as he drove the bus forward. "How you doing?" Derek shifted in his seat, glancing around nervously. He was clearly still unsure of himself, but he looked like he was trying. I went to the shelter," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I checked it out like you said." James's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. "And how was it?" Derek hesitated. "It wasn't easy, but it felt right. They talked to me, got me into a program. I don't know what'll happen next, but it's a start." James smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "That's all anyone can ask for. You're on the right path." Derek nodded, his eyes meeting James's once again. "Thanks," he said softly. "I didn't think anyone cared, but I think you do." James smiled back, his chest swelling with pride. "Of course I care. You're not alone in this." As the bus continued its route, Derek sat in silence, but James could see the subtle change in him. He wasn't the same person who had climbed onto the bus the day before. Derek had made a choice. He had taken a step toward turning his life around. And while the road ahead would be hard, James knew it was the first step of many. The rest of the day passed by in a blur for James. But his thoughts kept returning to Derek. He had done something good, something meaningful. It was small, but it was something. And maybe, just maybe, that was all it took to change a life. As the days passed, James couldn't shake the feeling of hope that had come over him after his conversation with Derek. The young man's appearance on the bus had been a small yet meaningful sign that maybe, just maybe, his words had made a difference. But James knew that the road to change was long and uncertain. It wasn't enough to give someone advice or point them in the right direction. Change required effort, and it was something that came from within. Despite his optimism, James still wasn't sure what would happen to Derek in the long run. Would he stick with the shelter? Would he be able to fight the demons that had haunted him for so long? Only time would tell, but James couldn't help but think about the young man during his shifts. Every time he looked at the faces around him on the bus, he wondered if any of them, like Derek, were struggling beneath the surface. He had always believed in the power of kindness, but sometimes it felt like the weight of the world was too much for anyone to handle alone. One afternoon, as James was driving through the city streets, he noticed a familiar face waiting at the bus stop. It was Derek again. This time he wasn't standing stiffly, his head down in defeat. He was standing tall, his shoulders back, and there was something different in his posture. He seemed more at ease, as though the weight he had carried for so long was starting to lift, even if just a little. James stopped the bus and watched as Derek boarded. The young man's face lit up when he saw James behind the wheel, and he made his way to the seat near the front, sitting down without hesitation. There was something in his eyes now, something that had been missing before. It was hard to describe, but it was unmistakable. "Hey man," James greeted him warmly. "How's it going?" Derek smiled, his face brighter than it had been the last time they spoke. "It's going good," he said, his voice steadier than before. "I've been sticking with the program and it's been helping. I got a job at the shelter, helping out with the intake process. It's not much, but it's something." James nodded, impressed by Derek's progress. "That's great, man. Really great to hear. Sounds like you're making some good moves." Derek's smile grew wider. "Yeah, I think I am. It's not perfect, but it feels like I'm finally getting a grip on things. I've been talking to a counselor, and they've been helping me a lot. It's a lot to take in, but I think I'm starting to believe that things can be better." James smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had seen many people come and go on his bus, but there was something special about Derek's journey. The young man wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to live again. "I'm proud of you, Derek," James said, his voice sincere. "It's not easy, but you're doing it. You've got a lot of strength." Derek looked down at his hands for a moment, almost as if he were reflecting on the journey that had led him here. "I never thought I had strength," he said quietly. I always thought I was too weak to make it out. I didn't think anyone cared, but I guess I was wrong. James could sense the vulnerability in Derek's voice, but it wasn't the same vulnerability he had seen before, the kind that was weighed down by shame and hopelessness. This was different. It was the kind of vulnerability that came with accepting one's past and finding the courage to move forward. "You're stronger than you think," James said, his voice firm, but gentle. "It's easy to forget that when life knocks you down, but trust me, you're not weak. It takes strength to admit you need help, and it takes strength to keep going, even when things get tough." Derek nodded slowly, absorbing James's words. "I think you're right," he said, a hint of determination in his voice. "I've got a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can keep going. I'm not giving up." James couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for Derek. It wasn't about fixing someone's problems or solving their struggles. It was about offering support, being there when it mattered, and giving them the tools they needed to help themselves. Derek was doing the hard work now. James had merely pointed him in the right direction. As the bus continued its route, Derek settled into his seat, his posture still upright, his eyes focused. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself now. James could see it, a sense of purpose that had been absent before. The young man wasn't just drifting anymore. He was making decisions, taking control of his life, and slowly but surely, building a future for himself. But even as Derek made strides toward a better life, James knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when Derek would feel like giving up. That was the nature of recovery and change. It wasn't linear. But as long as Derek kept moving forward, even in the smallest of ways, James believed he could overcome anything. The bus ride ended as it always did, with the familiar sights of the city flashing by. Derek stood up to leave, his eyes meeting James's once more. "Thanks again," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't think I'd be here without you." James nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did the hard part, Derek. You made the choice to change. I'm just glad I could be there to help." As Derek stepped off the bus and disappeared into the crowd, James felt a sense of fulfillment that he couldn't quite put into words. He had seen so many people come and go in his years as a bus driver, but Derek's journey would stay with him. It reminded him of why he did what he did, why he showed up every day driving people from one place to another. It wasn't just about getting people to their destinations. It was about making a connection, even if it was for a brief moment. James drove the bus back to the depot, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He knew that there were still many people out there who needed help, who needed someone to believe in them. But for today, he had helped one person find their way, and that was enough. A few weeks had passed since James had last seen Derek. Every day as he drove the bus along the familiar route, he thought about the young man. Derek had made so much progress in such a short time, but James knew that the journey wasn't over. Change, real change, didn't happen overnight, but what mattered most was that Derek had started the process. James had always believed that a person's true strength could be seen in how they handled their setbacks, their failures, and their struggles. He had faced his own obstacles in life, times when he had felt lost, unsure of himself, and unsure of his future. But over the years, he had learned that it wasn't the obstacles that defined a person, it was how they chose to overcome them. One morning, James boarded the bus with the usual mix of quiet anticipation and routine. He started his engine, checked the rearview mirror, and began his route. It was a beautiful, clear day. The streets were busy and the morning rush had already begun. But despite the bustle around him, James couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. Today felt different. He wasn't sure why, but it did. As the bus made its way through the city, James noticed a familiar face at one of the stops. Derek was standing there looking just like he had the first time James had seen him. Nervous, uncertain. But there was something new this time. Something different. This time, Derek's posture was straight, his head held high, and he wasn't waiting to board the bus with that same defeated look he'd had before. This time, there was a sense of purpose in his movements, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. James stopped the bus and waved to Derek as he boarded. The young man's eyes met his, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. Derek made his way to the front of the bus, and for the first time in weeks, James saw a smile on his face. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was real, and it meant more than any words James could have said. "Hey, man." James greeted him, his voice warm. "How's everything going?" Derek took a seat near the front, his face lighting up with a smile that seemed to have been missing for so long. "It's going really well," he said, his voice steady. "I've been working at the shelter for a couple of weeks now, and I've been helping out with some of the other guys there. It's not always easy, but it feels good, you know? I'm doing something meaningful." James nodded, feeling a surge of pride for the young man. "I'm glad to hear that. I knew you had it in you." Derek looked down for a moment, almost as if he were thinking carefully about his next words. "I don't know if I would have made it this far without you," he said quietly. "You were the first person who really took the time to talk to me. I didn't realize it at the time, but it meant a lot." James smiled, shaking his head. "You did all the hard work, Derek. You made the decision to change. I just pointed you in the right direction. You're the one who's been putting in the effort." Derek met his eyes, his expression serious but grateful. "I know, but I think it was your words that made me believe it was possible. I was so lost before. I didn't think anyone cared, and I didn't think I had the strength to make it out, but I think I'm starting to believe in myself again." James could hear the conviction in Derek's voice. He was no longer the young man who had boarded the bus weeks ago with a look of defeat in his eyes. He was someone else now, someone who had faced the hardest part of change, the decision to start. "You're doing great, Derek," James said, his voice filled with encouragement. "You've already come so far, and you're going to keep moving forward." Derek nodded slowly, looking out the window as the bus made its way through the city. "I've still got a lot to work on," he admitted, "but every day I feel a little more like myself. And I feel like I'm building something. I'm getting my life back together, and it feels good, really good." James watched the young man, proud of the progress he had made. He didn't know what the future held for Derek, but he knew that this was a turning point for him. Sometimes the hardest part of change wasn't the effort itself. It was the belief that things could get better. Derek had taken that first step, and now he was walking the path of recovery and self-discovery. As the bus continued its route, James couldn't help but reflect on his own life. He had always believed in the power of small moments, the moments where a simple conversation, a kind word, or even just being there for someone could make all the difference. It was easy to forget that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the biggest impact. Derek had been a reminder of that. By the time they reached the end of the route, Derek stood up to leave. He turned to James with a smile, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thanks again, man. I don't think I'll ever forget what you did for me." James gave him a nod, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "You don't need to thank me, Derek. You did the hard part. You took control of your life. That's something to be proud of." As Derek stepped off the bus and walked down the sidewalk, James couldn't help but feel like he had witnessed something extraordinary. It wasn't just about helping someone find a shelter or offering a few words of encouragement. It was about seeing someone's life change before his eyes. It was about witnessing a young man who had been lost now finding his way. For James, that was enough. He didn't need recognition or praise. He didn't need anyone to thank him. All he needed was to know that for one person at least he had made a difference. The days turned into weeks, and as the months passed, James continued his usual routine, driving the bus through the city streets. He had seen countless faces come and go, each person with their own story, their own struggles, and their own dreams. But there was something about Derek that had stayed with him. It wasn't just the fact that he had helped him, but the journey that the young man was on, the growth, the change, and the slow but steady transformation into someone who believed in himself again. James often found himself thinking about Derek. Was he still working at the shelter? Had he found a sense of stability? Was he still keeping up with the recovery process? Every time he saw a young man on his bus, he wondered if it could be Derek, walking a little taller, looking a little more confident. But it had been a while since Derek had boarded his bus, and James knew that sometimes people moved on, finding new paths and new lives that didn't always cross with old ones. It was a quiet afternoon when James saw a familiar face waiting at the bus stop. There, standing near the curb, was Derek. This time he wasn't just standing there looking lost or unsure. He was waiting with purpose, his posture upright, his face calm and confident. James stopped the bus, and as Derek boarded, there was a moment of recognition between them, an unspoken understanding. "Hey, man," James greeted him, smiling warmly. "It's good to see you." Derek's smile in return was even brighter than before. "It's good to see you too," he said, his voice steady, filled with a sense of pride. He walked to the front of the bus and sat down, his eyes meeting James's with a look that said more than words could express. "How've you been?" James asked as he started the bus, his voice filled with curiosity and warmth. Derek paused for a moment before answering, as though choosing his words carefully. "I've been good," he said, his voice calm but with a note of pride. "I'm still working at the shelter. It's been a little over 6 months now, and I've been helping out with the new guys who come in. I'm also going to school now, part-time. It's not easy, but it feels like I'm finally getting my life together." James felt a surge of pride for the young man. Derek had come so far. Just months ago, he had been a stranger, unsure of where his life was headed. Now he was on a path that wasn't easy, but one that had purpose and meaning. "That's amazing," James said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I'm really proud of you, Derek. You've worked hard to get where you are." Derek nodded, his eyes focused ahead as the bus made its way down the road. "I still have a lot to learn, but I feel like I'm on the right track now. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to be better every day. I've been keeping up with my therapy too. It's a lot of work, but it's all worth it." James nodded, listening carefully. "It's not about being perfect," he said, his voice filled with understanding. "It's about taking small steps and doing your best. That's all anyone can do. And you're doing it." Derek turned to face James, his expression serious but grateful. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you," he said quietly. "You're the one who talked to me that day when I didn't even know if I wanted to keep going. I think about that moment a lot. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't said something." James was taken aback by the sincerity in Derek's voice. "I just pointed you in the right direction," he said, shaking his head. "You did the hard part, Derek. You chose to change. That's the toughest thing to do. The rest is just taking it day by day." Derek smiled, his eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and determination. "Yeah, I know. But your words made me believe it was possible. I've never had someone believe in me like that before." The conversation shifted as they continued on the route, but James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Derek had come so far. He had taken control of his life, and now he was not only helping others but also looking toward his own future with hope. It was a testament to the power of one person's kindness, a reminder of how important it was to never underestimate the impact a simple conversation could have on someone's life. As they neared the end of the route, Derek stood up to leave. He paused for a moment before turning back to James. "Thanks again," Derek said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'll never forget what you did for me." James smiled warmly. "You don't have to thank me, Derek. You're the one who made it happen. Just keep doing what you're doing." Derek gave him a nod, and for the first time James saw the young man truly walk away with confidence, a sense of purpose in his step. There was no longer any doubt in James's mind. Derek had found his path, and he was walking it with determination and strength. As the bus pulled away, James reflected on the journey he had witnessed. It wasn't just about a bus driver giving a piece of advice to a troubled young man. It was about the power of kindness, the impact of believing in someone when they couldn't believe in themselves. Derek had made the choice to change, and while the road hadn't been easy, he had walked it with courage and resilience. James knew that there would always be more people to help, more moments where his kindness could make a difference. But Derek's story was a reminder that sometimes one small moment, one simple conversation, could change everything for someone. It was a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small the action may seem. The rest of the day went by in a blur, but James carried the warmth of the conversation with him, knowing that his work, his simple, everyday work, had a greater purpose than just driving a bus. He wasn't just a driver. He was a part of people's lives, their stories and their journeys. As the bus came to a stop at the depot, James parked the vehicle and sat there for a moment, reflecting on the day. He thought about Derek, about the change he had seen in him, and about all the people he had helped along the way. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. James got out of the bus and walked to the depot entrance, feeling a quiet sense of pride. He had done something meaningful today, and for him that was enough.